Hello and welcome to the first episode of Consulting the Archives, a series where we go in-depth on the various aspects of how to play Grand Archive. I'll be making these videos in no particular order, but I'll generally be going over things that viewers want explained in depth, sometimes things that I experience as a player that make me want to inform people. As a quick reminder, I'm Faceless Menace. I'm a judge for Grand Archive. This channel has several judges that are part of it, and that I will sometimes consult to confirm my information is correct. With the credentials out of the way, let's get into the first topic, shuffling. The first thing to know about shuffling properly is that it needs to be sufficiently random. Different shuffling methods fall on a scale with how random they actually are, so making sure you're using the right one to ensure a fair game is important. To keep this video somewhat contained, I'll be going over 4 methods today: pile shuffling, overhand shuffling, riffling, and washing. I also want to take a moment to describe 2 aspects of randomness: individual randomness and packet randomness. A card is individually random if it has equal odds of being drawn as every other card in the deck. This is pretty easy to achieve with even less random shuffling methods, and is the reason why most people think their deck is shuffled, when it really isn't. The more important kind of randomness is packet randomness, which is where if you see a certain order of cards drawn in a deck, you can predict the next card to be drawn based on which cards you drew beforehand. Now to go over how each shuffling method impacts packets of cards, starting with pile shuffling. Pile shuffling is fairly common in a lot of TCGs. It's where you take your deck of cards and start putting them into a set number of piles. The most obvious problem with this shuffling method is that it takes forever to complete. Even if you're used to it, it often takes upwards of a minute to pile shuffle once. The other problem that many don't want to admit is that it isn't actually random in the slightest. If I take 12 cards and pile shuffle them, they will be in the same order every time I do it from the same starting position. This does move the cards around, but if you can predict where they'll be, you can also figure out what you'll draw after your current set of cards. This effectively takes whatever packets of cards you had and makes new packets of cards. So although they're in a different order, they're not in a random order. As an example, this pile of 12 cards after 3 pile shuffles will return back to the default order every time. It's incredibly predictable and not suitable for any TCG that needs both players' decks to be fairly shuffled. My only defense for pile shuffling is it is a great way to count cards right after building a deck, or after a round to ensure your deck count is as it should be. It can also be acceptable in combination with other shuffling methods, but you can't count pile shuffling as adding any actual randomness to the deck. The next way to shuffle is overhand shuffling. This is where you take a section of the deck and move it to the top or bottom of that same deck. This method works to randomize packets within that deck, but only randomizes those packets 2 cards at a time. If I take this deck of 30, you'll see exactly how randomized it gets after 10 of these shuffles. It does mix things up, but does so very slowly. This is also essentially a series of cuts to the deck into piles of 3, which is why I do like finishing off a full shuffle with this method. It's easy, it's fast, and it's random enough to supplement other shuffling methods. However, it's not allowed as a way on its own of making a sufficiently random deck. Now for mine, and in fact the recommended shuffle method, riffle shuffling, or riffling. Some people think of riffling as that way to shuffle cards where you bend the deck. Do not do that. You do not need to physically bend your cards in order to riffle shuffle them. The only time you do is if they're unsleeved. But in that case, please just buy some sleeves. Trading card games can be expensive, and I wouldn't treat my Grand Archive decks how I treat a cheap deck of playing cards. Now, the way you riffle without bending is simple. Take 2 halves of the deck, mash them together. You don't want to damage anything, so don't apply a bunch of pressure, just let the cards slide together. And you've just riffled. You do this 7 or 8 times, your deck is more random than any other method described so far in a fraction of the time. The reason being, take a close look. As the cards slide past each other, they don't go cleanly into A, B, A, B. From one half of the deck being A, the second half being B. They go A, B, B, A, B, A, etc., etc. You have so many cards breaking out of their old known orders and becoming untied to any pre-existing packets, so you end up with half the deck randomized out of packets each time you riffle. If you throw in overhand shuffling to shift cards around in between, you get it randomized even more effectively. This makes riffling the easiest and most random method of shuffling, except for the last method. It's also the only recommended shuffle in the Efficient Tournament Rules and Guidelines, which I will link down below. The last method I want to talk about is one that I do not ever recommend doing to your trading cards of any game, even while sleeved: washing. Washing is where you take your deck of cards, put it onto the table, and then push all the cards around until everything has been sufficiently randomized. This can be a very quick and a very random method, but the likelihood of damaging your cards and splitting sleeves is much higher than any other method. In terms of packet randomness, you can be sure that you won't be able to predict the next card drawn, unless it destroys the card, in which case it'll be very easy to see. As a little bonus topic, I want to talk about cutting decks. There can be a lot of mistakes made when cutting the opponent's deck, especially over webcam. Something I've seen recently is people presenting the deck as 3 piles and asking their opponent to choose the order of the piles. This is only technically cutting in the loosest sense. The point of cutting a deck is to add one final bit of randomness to a deck and ensure that your opponent isn't using any funny shuffling methods to cheat. If your opponent presents the piles, how can you be sure that the piles themselves don't have good cards put on top of all of them? In a perfect world, I'd like to believe we don't have any cheaters playing Grand Archive, but why give people the opportunity? A deck of cards should always be presented as a whole deck in front of the other player, and you should always mix up your cuts. There's nothing wrong with half cuts, but try to throw in cutting a few cards from the top every once in a while. If your cuts are unpredictable, it takes away any opportunities for the opponent to stack the deck around a given cut. Finally, if you feel like your opponent hasn't properly randomized their deck, you are allowed to shuffle their deck as your cut. I very rarely have to do this, but if your opponent is just pile shuffling and nothing else, feel free to give it a few riffles. If your opponent has an issue with it, then call a judge over and have them shuffle it properly in your stead. In addition to this, as a quick little aside, you can just tell your opponent, hey, I don't think you shuffled that properly, can you please do a riffle shuffle, etc. You don't need to be rude about it, but just, talking to your opponent is in fact a valid strategy in a 2-person game. That's everything I wanted to cover for this episode of Consulting the Archives. Let me know if you liked the video or not. Give me your suggestions for future episodes. I'll be trying to make these at least once or twice a month. It does take longer to make these videos since I need to do my research, write down my thoughts as a script, but I hope you all like the more research videos. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you next time.